So, here's something worth thinking about as you settle in tonight. Off the coast of Cape Cod, under cold gray water and a few feet of sand, there is pirate treasure. Real gold and silver. It is the only pirate treasure ever found and proven true out of every pirate story that has ever been told. And most of it is still down there. Tonight we are going to follow it, slowly, from the very beginning. If you drift off somewhere along the way, that is perfectly fine. The story will still be here in the morning. So let's start where the story actually starts. The ship is called the Whydah. You say it a little like Ouidah. It was a wooden sailing ship, and it went down one night in the spring of the year 1717, in a storm, just off a long, thin arm of sand called Cape Cod. Almost everyone aboard drowned in the dark. And then the sea pulled the ship down into the sand and held it there for more than 2.5 centuries. You are probably somewhere warm and dry right now. That is good. Hold on to that, because a lot of this story happens in cold water, and you never have to be anywhere near it. You are only listening. You can close your eyes whenever you like. For a long time, nobody could find the Ouidah. People knew, more or less, where she had sunk. There were old maps and old letters that said so. But the sea moves sand around, and 300 years is a long time, and the ship simply was not where anyone thought she should be. Treasure hunters looked. They came back with nothing. The whole thing slid into the space between history and legend, where a lot of pirate stories live. A wreck full of gold, somewhere off a quiet beach that nobody could quite put a hand on. And then a man found it. Not all at once. Slowly, over a few seasons, working out of a small boat in bad weather. He found coins first, then a cannon, then, in the end, a bell, a bronze ship's bell, with a name and a date cast into the metal. And the name was the Ouidah, and that changed everything. Because a wreck with treasure could be almost any wreck, but a wreck with the ship's own name on the bell is proof. It made the Ouidah the first pirate ship in history that anyone has ever been truly certain about. Not a guess, not a story, a named ship, with her captain, and her dead, and her gold. We are going to walk through all of it, where the ship came from, and what she was built to do, which is not a kind story. Who the pirate was who took her, and why people have wanted to like him for 300 years. The one storm, the 2 men who lived, and the long, patient work of bringing the wreck back up, coin by coin, out of the dark. But we'll get to the storm. Let's start somewhere quieter. Let's start in a city, on a river, a couple of years before any of the trouble. The year is around 1715. The place is London, and on the banks of the River Thames, where the water is brown and busy and crowded with masts, there is a shipyard. This is where the Ouidah is born. Not as a pirate ship. She has no idea what she is going to become if a ship can be said to have ideas, which of course it cannot. She is just timber and rope and tar, being shaped by men with hand tools into a particular kind of vessel for a particular kind of trade. She is what they called a galley. That word can be confusing, so let's slow down on it for a second. When you hear galley, you might picture rows of men chained to oars in an ancient sea. That is not this. In this period, a galley just meant a sailing ship that was built long and lean for speed, with the option of a few oars, or sweeps, to move her in a dead calm. She had 3 masts and square sails. She was built to go fast and to carry a lot, around 110 feet long, rated at about 300 tons. When the wind was right, she could reach something like 13 knots, which for a ship of her size and her time was genuinely quick. She was well made. That matters later. A cheap ship would have come apart sooner. The Whydah was solid, expensive, purpose-built, and she was fast, and all of that is exactly why a pirate would one day look at her and want her more than anything else on the water. Now, the name, Ouidah. It is a strange word to modern ears, and it deserves a moment, because it tells you what this ship was for. She was named after a place, a port on the coast of West Africa, in what is now the country of Benin. The town today is usually spelled Ouidah. In the Old English of the sailors and the merchants, it came out as Whydah, and that port was one of the largest, busiest points of departure in the whole Atlantic slave trade. So that is what the Ouidah was built to be. A slave ship. That is the plain fact underneath everything else in this story, and we are not going to hurry past it, because it is the beginning of the ship, and it is the reason there was ever any treasure at all. She was built for a man named Sir Humphrey Morris. He was a wealthy London merchant, and later a member of Parliament, and for a stretch of years, he was one of the biggest slave traders in England. He was not a pirate. He was a respectable man, in the way the word respectable was used then. He owned ships, and he sent them south and west to make him money, and the Ouidah was one of the newest and best of them. A clean, quick, well-found ship, sent out to do a terrible thing, legally, with paperwork, under the protection of the law. Keep that phrase somewhere in the back of your mind, under the protection of the law. It comes back later, in the mouth of a pirate, and it lands very differently. For now, just picture the ship finished. New timber, still pale in places, sails bent onto the yards, a crew signing on at the London docks, and a bell, cast in bronze, hung where the crew could ring the hours. Somebody stamped a name and a year into that bell before it ever went to sea. The Whydah Gally, 1716. That same bell, with those same words, is going to come back at the very end of the story, out of the mud, into a diver's hands, almost 300 years later. But she does not know that. Nobody does. She is just a new ship on a gray river, about to sail. So let's follow her out, down the Thames, past the other ships, out into the open water, and south toward a coast she is named for, and a trade that will, in a strange and roundabout way, be the making of her legend and the death of nearly everyone who ever sailed her. A voyage like the Ouidah's ran in a great triangle across the Atlantic, and it is worth understanding the shape of it, because the shape is the whole grim engine of the thing. She would leave England loaded with goods, cloth, iron, guns, brandy, and, in enormous quantity, small cast rings of brass and copper, bracelets really, that were used as money along the African coast. They were called manillas. Thousands of them went out in the holds of ships like this one, and we will see some of those very manillas again at the end of tonight's story, corroded green, brought up off the sea floor by divers 300 years later. But that is later. For now, they are cargo, money on its way to buy people. The Ouidah sailed south and east and reached the coast of West Africa, and the port she was named for, Ouidah. And there, the goods in her hold were traded for human beings, men, women, and children who had been captured or sold inland and marched to the coast and held in barracoons by the water, waiting for ships exactly like this one. It is estimated that the Ouidah took on something like 500 captives, 500 people put below the deck of a 110-foot ship in the dark, in chains, for the crossing. That crossing has a name. The Middle Passage. It was the middle leg of the triangle, from Africa to the Americas, and it was one of the worst things human beings have ever routinely done to other human beings. Weeks at sea, barely any room, disease. Many did not survive it. We are not going to dwell on the details tonight. partly because you are trying to rest, and partly because the plain fact is heavy enough on its own without decoration. This beautiful, fast, well-built ship spent the first months of her life as an instrument of that. It is the true beginning of her, and it is why, when the treasure comes, the treasure is not clean. It never was. The Ouidah crossed the Atlantic and came into the Caribbean, most likely to the island of Jamaica, and there the surviving captives were sold for coin, for gold and silver. And that is the third leg of the triangle, the money leg. The whole point of the voyage, from the merchant's cold point of view, was to turn goods into people and people into treasure. So by early in the year 1717, the Ouidah had done exactly that. Her human cargo was gone, sold ashore into lives we can barely stand to imagine. And in her hold, in its place, was the profit: silver, gold, sugar and indigo and other valuable goods bought with the proceeds. She was, at that moment, a floating fortune, riding low in the water, turning back east to carry all of that home to London and to Sir Humphrey Maurice. She never made it home, because out on that bright Caribbean water, in late February, another set of sails came up over the horizon and began to close in. And to understand those sails, we have to leave the ship for a while and meet the man who was chasing her. So let's come inward, away from the trade routes, to a quieter place, a small English village some years earlier, because the pirate who is about to take the Ouidah did not start as a pirate. Almost none of them did. His name was Samuel Bellamy. History mostly remembers him as Black Sam. He was born in the west of England, in Devon, in the countryside near Dartmoor, around the year 1689. That would make him somewhere in his 20s for everything that happens in this story. Young, younger than you might picture a pirate captain. He came from very little. A poor family, in a hard part of a hard century, and a boy from that background who wanted more than a life of nothing, much really had only one road out, and that road was the sea. So he went to sea young, as a sailor, probably in the Royal Navy for a time and then in merchant ships. He learned the trade the honest way first, how to hand and reef and steer, how a ship works in weather, how men behave when they are frightened and far from land. All of that would matter later. But at this point, he is nobody. One more skilled, restless, poor young sailor among thousands, looking for the thing that would change his life. And then, the way the story is usually told, he found it on Cape Cod. Or rather, he found her. Here we have to be a little careful, because this is where history and legend start to braid together, and I want to be honest with you about which is which. The legend goes like this. Around the year 1715, Samuel Bellamy came to Cape Cod, and in a tavern in a town called Eastham, he met a young local woman named Maria Hallett, and they fell in love. She is sometimes called Goody Hallett, and later, in the darker version of the tale, the Witch of Wellfleet. The story says she was very young and very beautiful, and that Bellamy had no money and no standing, and that her family would never allow it. So he made her a promise. He would go to sea, and he would come back rich enough to marry her and take her away. How much of that is true? Honestly, we do not know. Maria Hallett may have been a real person, or a composite, or mostly a legend that grew up around the wreck afterward. The romance is not in any court record. What is real is that Bellamy did head for the Caribbean around this time, chasing money the way an ambitious poor man does, and that the treasure he was chasing did end up pointed back toward Cape Cod at the very end. Whether a woman was waiting on that shore, we cannot prove. But the story has never let go of the idea, and by the time you have followed the whole thing, you will understand why people wanted a woman on the beach. It gives a very cold ending something warm to stand next to. So Bellamy went south. The plan, at least at first, was legitimate. He and a partner meant to hunt for treasure of a different kind, the wrecks of an old Spanish fleet that had gone down in a hurricane off the coast of Florida, spilling silver into shallow water. Salvage. Legal, or legal enough. Half the adventurers in the Caribbean were out there diving on those wrecks, hoping to come up rich. But the easy silver was mostly gone or guarded, and Bellamy and his partner came up with nothing. Broke. Stranded. A long way from home, with a promise to keep and no way to keep it. And that is the moment. That is where a man decides who he is going to be. There was money on the water. There were slow, fat merchant ships everywhere, full of exactly the kind of wealth Bellamy had crossed an ocean to find. And there were men, hard men, already taking it. So he made his choice. He would take it too. He fell in with pirates. And within a startlingly short time, this poor boy from Devon was not just one of them. He was leading them. The men Bellamy joined were led, at first, by an older pirate named Benjamin Hornigold, and in that same company was another man whose name you almost certainly know, a tall, wild-looking figure who had not yet become the legend he would become, Edward Teach, Blackbeard. For a little while, at the start, these three were sailing more or less together, Hornigold, the old hand, Blackbeard on his way up, and Bellamy, the newest, the youngest, learning fast. There was a split. Hornigold, oddly enough, had a rule. He would not attack English ships. He still thought of himself as a kind of privateer, loyal in his way to his own country's flag. But the crews were done with that. There was too much English money on the water to leave it alone out of sentiment, so they took a vote. And that is the first thing to understand about these men, because it surprises people. They voted. Pirate companies of this period were, in their rough way, small democracies. The crew elected the captain, and the crew could remove him. The plunder was shared out by an agreed set of rules written down and signed. The captain got a slightly larger share in command in a fight, and almost nothing else. It was, for the time, a strangely level way for men to live. The vote went against Hornigold. He kept his rule and sailed off with the few who agreed with him, and the rest of them elected a new captain to lead the ones who wanted to take any ship worth taking. They elected Samuel Bellamy, the poor boy from Devon, now a pirate captain, still only in his 20s. He turned out to be very good at it. And here is where the legend around Bellamy really begins, the part that has made people want to like him for 300 years. Because, by most accounts, he was not cruel. In an age of genuinely brutal men, Black Sam had a reputation for something closer to generosity. He tried not to kill people he did not have to kill. He often let captured crews go, and gave them a ship to go in. Men he captured sometimes chose to join him rather than leave, which tells you something. His own crew were fond of him, and they had a name for themselves, half a joke and half a belief. They called themselves Robin Hood's men, and Bellamy they called the Prince of Pirates. There is a speech attached to his name, and I want to give it to you carefully, because it is famous, and it is also probably too good to be entirely true. It comes from an old book about the pirates of this era, a book that mixed real reporting with a fair amount of invention. So treat it as legend more than as a transcript. The story goes that Bellamy had captured a small ship, and its captain, a man named Beer, would not join him. And Bellamy, letting him go, is supposed to have said something like this, that he was sorry he could not return the man his ship because the crew had voted to sink it. And then, the harder part, that the captain was a coward for letting rich men govern him with laws they had made only to protect themselves. They rob the poor under the cover of law, Bellamy is supposed to have said, and we plunder the rich under the protection of our own courage. Whether he really said it word for word, we cannot know. Probably not exactly, but something in it has always felt true to the shape of the man, and it is why he became the Robin Hood of the sea in the popular memory. A poor man taking from the rich, out loud, without pretending it was anything other than what it was. Hold that thought against the ship he is about to capture. A ship whose entire fortune came from selling human beings, legally, under the protection of the law. There is no clean side in this. There is just a young man with a fast crew and a sharp tongue, sailing straight toward the wealthiest prize of his life. So let's come back to the water, to that bright morning in late February, 1717, in the passage between Cuba and the island of Hispaniola, near the edge of the Bahamas. Bellamy has 2 ships under him now, small ones, his own, a sloop called the Sultana, and a second sailing in company. And a lookout has just seen a large sail to the east, riding low and heavy in the water, the way a ship rides when she is full of cargo. That sail is the Ouidah, on her way home with the profit of her terrible voyage in her hold. Bellamy turns to chase. The chase took 3 days. That detail always slows people down, because we picture pirate attacks as sudden, a flag going up and a ship swarmed in an afternoon. This was not that. The Ouidah was fast, remember, one of the fastest ships of her kind. Her captain, a man named Lawrence Prince, could see the pirates coming and ran for it. And for 3 days, across open sea, the 2 smaller pirate ships slowly, patiently, ate away at the Ouidah's lead. Day and night, watching the gap close. It is a strange thing to think about. 3 days of quiet, deliberate pursuit under a hot sky. Everyone aboard both ships knowing more or less how it was going to end. At last, near the Bahamas, they ran the Ouidah down, and when the moment came, there was almost no fight in it. A few shots, a gesture really. Lawrence Prince looked at the pirates alongside, and looked at his own men, and made the sensible choice. He struck his colors. He surrendered. Nobody sane dies for another man's cargo. And then Bellamy did the thing that fits the legend. He did not harm Lawrence Prince. He did not harm the crew. Instead, he gave Prince his own sloop, the Sultana, to sail away in, and by most accounts, handed him a sum of money on top of it. A small purse of silver and gold, more or less. A thank you for not making it difficult. The captured captain sailed off, alive and paid, to carry the news home. And Bellamy stepped aboard his enormous new prize and looked around at what he had. He had the finest ship he had ever stood on. Fast, strong, roomy, and riding in her hold, a fortune. He was not going to sell this one and move on. He looked at the Ouidah, and he knew exactly what she was going to be. She was going to be his flagship, the ship he would carry his name on, and his crew, and everything he had ever taken. So let's follow him aboard and see what he turned her into. The first thing Bellamy did was make the Ouidah into a warship. She had come off the London River armed, the way a valuable slave ship had to be, with something like 18 guns aboard and the room for more. Bellamy filled that room. He added cannon until she carried around 28 guns run out along her sides, and by some accounts, he stowed still more below, down in the belly of the ship, partly as spare firepower and partly as ballast, iron weight to keep her steady and low. A ship of that size, that fast, with that many guns, was a serious thing on the water. Very few merchantmen would even think about fighting her. Most would do exactly what Lawrence Prince had done. They would see her coming and give up. Then he loaded her with everything. Bellamy had been a busy pirate. Over the course of roughly a single year at the top of his trade, he and his crews are believed to have taken more than 50 ships. 50. Dozens and dozens of prizes, some large, most small, each one stripped of whatever it carried that was worth carrying. Coin, bar silver, gold dust, sugar, indigo, ivory, cloth, tools, weapons, medicine, rum. All of it flowing into the holds of Bellamy's ships, and now, with the Ouidah as his flagship, concentrating into one place. This was not the scattered, spent-as-you-go living of a small-time raider. This was accumulation, a fortune, gathering in the hold of one very fast ship. We do not know the exact size of that fortune, and I want to be honest about that, rather than give you a number that sounds too neat. The best figures we have come from the men who survived, who later testified about what the ship had carried. They spoke of the treasure being divided up into sacks, small sacks of about 50 pounds each, so it could be shared out among the crew by the rules they had all signed. And by their account, there were something like 180 of those sacks. If you do the arithmetic gently, that comes out to somewhere in the range of 4.5 to 5 tons of gold, silver, gold dust, and jewelry. A range, not a certainty. But even at the low end, 4.5 tons of precious metal is an almost absurd amount of wealth to have riding in the hold of a single wooden ship, in the care of one man not yet 30 years old. So what would all of that be worth today? People always want to ask, and the honest answer is that nobody can really say. Do you price it by the raw weight of the silver and gold? By what those coins could actually buy in Bellamy's world? Or by what a single verified pirate coin fetches now, from a collector who wants to hold a piece of the only real pirate treasure on Earth? Each way of counting gives a wildly different answer, and most of the eye-watering figures you will see attached to the Whydah are really just guesses in fancy clothes, so let's not pretend to a number. It was a great deal of money. That is about as far as the truth will safely go. And among that crew, sharing in those rules, was a boy. This is one of the small details that stays with people, so let's slow down for him. His name was John King, and he was somewhere around 8 to 11 years old. A child. He had been a passenger, with his mother, on a ship that Bellamy captured some months earlier, and when the pirates were leaving, John King did not want to stay behind. He wanted to go with them. The accounts say he was so determined that he threatened to harm himself, and even threatened his own mother, if he was not allowed to join. Whatever the truth of a frightened child's words, the result is not in doubt. The boy went with the pirates. He became, as far as anyone knows, the youngest pirate ever recorded. And he was aboard the Ouidah, one small member of the company, when she turned north. We will meet John King one more time, at the very end, in a way you will not expect. So hold on to him. A boy, on a treasure ship, sailing up a cold coast, because that is the last strange choice in the story. Bellamy had his perfect ship and his enormous fortune. He could have gone anywhere warm and safe. Instead, he turned north, up the long coast of the American colonies, toward New England, toward Cape Cod. But why north, of all directions? Why leave the warm, crowded, profitable waters where nearly every prize he had ever taken was found, and steer toward a cold coast he did not know? We do not entirely know. Maybe he meant to set up a base up there, away from the crowded Caribbean. Maybe the fleet simply drifted north, taking prizes as it went. And maybe, if you like the legend, there was a young woman on a beach and a promise to keep. The historians shrug at that last one, and you should too, a little. But you do not have to let go of it. Nobody ever really has. So let's follow the ship north, and let's slow the whole story down now, because we are coming to the quietest and the hardest part, and there is no need to rush toward it. It is April, the spring of 1717. The Ouidah is moving up the coast with at least one other ship in company, a smaller captured vessel sailing along with her. The water is colder here. The light is different, grayer, thinner than the hard, bright light of the Caribbean. This is not the pirates' home water. Cape Cod is a strange piece of geography, a long, curved arm of low sand reaching out into the North Atlantic, and the water around it is treacherous in ways a captain from warmer seas would not fully know. Shifting sandbars, shoals that move, a coast that, in bad weather, gives a ship almost nothing to hold on to. For now, though, it is just a passage north. Picture the ship in ordinary time, before anything goes wrong. The creak of the rigging, the watch changing, the bell being rung to mark the hours, that same bronze bell with the name cast into it, men sleeping in their hammocks, the boy, John King, somewhere among them, the treasure below in its sacks, silent, heavy, doing nothing at all, a rich, fast, well-run ship, full of men who by their own lights were doing rather well, moving quietly up a darkening coast on an evening in late April, and out ahead of them, off to the northeast, the sky was beginning to change. You have probably felt the front edge of a big storm at some point. The air goes still and then strange. The light turns a color it should not be. Sailors of Bellamy's time could not see a storm coming the way we can now. They had no radio, no chart of the pressure, no warning at all beyond the sky and the sea and the ache in an old man's joints. They read the weather off the world in front of them, and by the time this particular weather announced itself clearly, it was already far too late to do very much about it. What was coming was a nor'easter. It is a specific and brutal kind of storm that forms along that coast, named for the direction the wind screams in from, out of the northeast, straight off the open Atlantic. It brings enormous wind and enormous seas, and it drives everything in front of it toward the land. And the Ouidah, with her fortune and her captain and her boy, was directly in front of it, with a lee shore of shifting sand at her back and nowhere good to go. So let's stay with her, gently, into the dark. The storm came in on the night of the 26th of April, 1717, and it came in hard. The best estimates we have, worked out later from the damage in the accounts, put the wind at something like 70 miles an hour, screaming out of the northeast, and the seas it raised at 30 to 40 feet. Try to picture that for a moment, from the safety of where you are. Walls of black water taller than a house, one after another, rolling in out of the dark with nothing to stop them, and a wooden ship somewhere in the middle of it, with men aboard who could not see the shore and could not find the open sea and could only hold on. Bellamy was a fine sailor. His crew were experienced. In deep water, with room to run, a ship like the Ouidah might have ridden a storm like this out, taking the seas on her quarter, giving way before the wind, surviving by sheer good handling. But she did not have room. The wind was driving her toward the land, toward that low coast of Cape Cod, and the land off her back was not rock she could see and steer away from. It was sand. Long, shallow, shifting bars of sand, hidden under the breaking water, reaching out from the beach further than anyone aboard could have known in the dark. At some point in the black middle of that night, the Ouidah struck. She came onto a sandbar, hard, probably stern first, in water only about 16 feet deep, a few hundred feet from a beach nobody aboard could see. And a ship of that size does not sit gently on a bar in a 40-foot sea. The waves picked her up and dropped her again and again, and she began to break apart. The masts came down, the hull opened. Everything that had been so carefully built and so carefully loaded, the guns, the treasure in its 180 sacks, the men, the boy, all of it, went into the cold surf in the dark. I am going to tell you what happened to the people plainly, once, and then we are going to move on, because this is a story to fall asleep to, and not a story to lie awake in. Of the roughly 146 men aboard the Ouidah that night, all but 2 died. Somewhere around 144 men drowned in the surf off Cape Cod, in water so cold and so violent that even strong swimmers had almost no chance. Samuel Bellamy died there with them. Black Sam, the prince of pirates, the poor boy from Devon who had crossed an ocean to come back rich. He was somewhere around 28 years old. He had been the most successful pirate on the Atlantic for a little less than a single year, and it ended in one night, in the dark, a few hundred feet from a beach, with his fortune spilling out around him into the sand. The other ship sailing in company, the smaller captured vessel, wrecked too, further down the coast, though more of her people managed to get ashore, and the treasure, the 4.5 to 5 tons of gold and silver, did not float and did not wash up in any neat pile. It sank. It went straight down into the churning sand right there where the ship came apart, heavy metal in heavy sacks, driven down and scattered and buried by the same waves that killed the men. And there it stayed. That is the moment the treasure went into the ground. Not hidden by a clever pirate with a map, just lost in a storm, in the dark, and then covered over by the sea. So let's come up out of the water now, gently, and let the storm blow itself out. Let's go to the morning. The morning after a nor'easter on Cape Cod is a strange, scoured, quiet thing. The wind drops, the sky clears to that thin, pale color, and the beach is covered in what the storm brought in. On the morning of the 27th of April, the people who lived along that shore came down to the beach, the way coastal people always have after a big storm, to see what the sea had left. And what the sea had left them that morning was terrible and astonishing at the same time. Wreckage everywhere, broken timber and torn rigging and shattered barrels strewn for miles along the sand, and bodies, more than 100 drowned men, laid along the tide line by the same surf that had killed them. And among all of that, glinting here and there in the wet sand, coins. Because the sea does not keep everything it takes. Some of that spilled treasure washed up along with the wreckage, and the local people, poor farmers and fishermen most of them, found it. This is where the story becomes very human and not at all heroic. The people of the Cape did what people do. They took what they found. Coins went into pockets. Useful timber and gear and cloth were quietly carried off the beach and put to use. By the time any authority arrived, the shore had already been picked over by everyone who lived within reach of it. Word of a wrecked pirate ship full of gold reached the colonial government quickly, and the governor of Massachusetts, a man named Samuel Shute, wanted that treasure for the crown. So he sent a man to go and get it. His name was Cyprian Southhack, and he is one of the quietly important figures in this whole 300-year story, though he had no idea at the time. Southhack was a mapmaker and a mariner, a careful, literate, official sort of man, and Shute gave him the authority to go to the wreck site, recover the king's treasure, and bury the dead. Southhack did his best, and his best was mostly a frustration. By the time he got there, the locals had scattered. Nobody would admit to finding anything. He recovered very little treasure, almost none of it really, and he spent a good deal of his time writing angry letters about how the people of the Cape were plundering the wreck faster than he could stop them. He reported seeing something like 200 men at work along the shore, going over the wreckage, taking what they could. He arranged for the drowned to be buried in the sand near where they came ashore. And crucially, being a map maker, he wrote down where he was. He drew the location. He described the beach, the wreck, the place. He put the Ouidah on a map. That map, and Southhack's careful, official, thoroughly annoyed paperwork, is a large part of the reason anyone was ever able to find the ship again. He failed to recover the gold, but by writing down exactly where he failed, he left a thread that someone, 2.5 centuries later, would be able to pick up and follow. So let's leave Southhack there on his cold beach, filing his reports, and follow the 2 men who actually lived through the night. 2 men came out of the surf alive. Only 2, out of the whole crew of the Whydah. How do only 2 live through a night like that? And why those 2 and not any of the others? There is no satisfying answer, the way there rarely is with the sea. It was luck, mostly, and where they happened to be when the ship came apart. But there is one small pattern worth noticing. Because they were, in a way, the 2 you might least expect, given that neither of them was really a pirate at heart. The first was a Welshman named Thomas Davis. He was a ship's carpenter, and he had not chosen this life. He had been aboard a ship the pirates captured, and they had kept him against his will, the way pirate crews often did with men whose skills they needed. A carpenter was too useful to let go. So Thomas Davis had been a prisoner of sorts, a forced man, working under the pirates because he had no choice. And on that night, he managed, somehow, to get through the breaking surf and onto the beach alive. He walked to the nearest house and told them what had happened. The second survivor was a young man named John Julian. He was a mosquito from the coast of Central America, and he was about 16 years old, and he was the ship's pilot, one of the men who knew how to read the water and steer the ship through it. He too came ashore alive that night, and his story afterward is the darkest thread in the whole tale, so I will tell it to you quietly. John Julian was not treated as a survivor of a disaster. He was a young man of color in colonial New England, and he was, in time, sold into slavery. The record of him grows thin after that, but the thread that remains suggests he spent the rest of his life enslaved and was eventually put to death many years later. He survived the sea, and the world he came ashore into did the rest. It is worth sitting with, for a moment, that the ship began its life carrying enslaved people, and that one of the 2 human beings to survive its end was then enslaved himself. The story keeps folding back on the same cruelty. The other men who lived through that night were not from the Ouidah at all. They came from the smaller ship that had wrecked further down the coast, and several of them made it ashore. And those men, along with Thomas Davis, were arrested and taken to Boston and put on trial as pirates. This was the autumn of 1717. The trial was a serious matter, presided over with all the weight of the colony's law and a good deal of stern preaching about sin and the sea. Thomas Davis was acquitted. He was able to convince the court of what was true, that he had been a prisoner, a forced man, kept for his skills, and never a willing pirate, and they let him go. A few others were spared for similar reasons, including at least one more man the court believed had been held against his will. But most of the captured men were found guilty, and in the November of 1717, they were hanged in Boston, at the edge of the water, as a public warning to anyone who might be tempted by the same life. It was, in its grim way, the official end of Samuel Bellamy's company. The captain drowned, the crew scattered on the sea floor or swinging from a Boston gallows, the Prince of Pirates and his Robin Hood's men gone in a single season. And then, for a very long time, nothing. This is the part of the story that is easy to skip over, and I do not want to skip it, because it is actually the longest part of all. The wreck lay off Wellfleet for nearly 270 years. Think about how long that is. Whole countries were founded and grew old in that time. The colonies became a nation. The nation fought wars, built cities, forgot and remembered 100 things. And the whole while, the Ouidah and her fortune lay a few 100 feet off a beach, under the sand and the cold gray water, doing nothing, wanted by no one who could find her. The treasure did not stay gone from people's minds, though. That is the thing about a lost fortune. It becomes a story, and the story does not sink. Along the Cape, for generations, people told each other about the pirate ship full of gold that had gone down off Wellfleet. Every so often, a storm would shift the sand, and a coin or two would turn up on the beach, just enough to keep the tale alive, just enough to make it not quite a fairy story. Treasure hunters came now and then and dug and dragged and came up with nothing, because the sand had taken the ship and moved on, and nobody knew exactly where under all that shifting bottom she actually lay. And the legend grew a person to carry it. Maria Hallett, the young woman Bellamy was supposed to have loved and promised to come back for. Over the years, she turned, in the telling, into something stranger and sadder. The Witch of Wellfleet. The stories said she had waited for him on the cliffs above the beach, watching the sea for his sails, and that when his ship came at last, it came only to break apart in the storm within sight of where she stood. Some versions said she went mad with grief. Some said she had made a bargain with the devil, or that the storm itself was her doing, or her punishment. She became a figure the local people half believed in, a woman in a wind-blown shape on the dunes, still watching an empty sea. How much of Maria Hallett was ever real, we truly cannot say. But she is what the human mind does with a story like this. It cannot leave a cold shipwreck as just a cold shipwreck. It puts a person on the shore and gives the loss a face. Even the great writers of the Cape walked that beach and felt the story under it. In the middle of the 1800s, more than a century after the wreck, when a man went walking the whole outer shore of Cape Cod and wrote a famous book about it, he passed along that very stretch of sand, and he wrote about the old tale of the pirate Bellamy and the ship full of treasure lying somewhere just offshore. So the story was still there, more than 100 years on, drifting up and down the beach with the wind, waiting. It just needed someone stubborn enough and modern enough to stop telling it and go get it. So let's come forward now, across all those quiet years, to a boy growing up on that same cape, listening to that same story and refusing to believe it was only a story. His name was Barry Clifford, and he grew up on Cape Cod in the middle of the 20th century, and he heard the story of the Ouidah the way every Cape child heard it, from an uncle, on a porch, in the offhand way that grown-ups pass along the tales they half believe. A pirate ship, full of gold, right out there, off Wellfleet. Most children hear a story like that and file it away with the sea serpents and the ghost lights. Barry Clifford heard it and never quite let it go. It stayed in him all the way up into adulthood, this stubborn certainty that the thing was real and that it was findable and that he was going to be the one to find it. The difference between Clifford and the treasure hunters who had failed before him was not really about equipment, although he had better equipment than the old diggers ever did. The difference was that he went and did his homework first. He understood that the sea had moved the ship, that she was not going to be lying in plain sight where she sank, that the whole coastline had shifted in 3 centuries. So instead of just dragging the bottom and hoping, he went to the documents, and the most important document, the one that made all the difference, was that old, annoyed, meticulous paperwork left behind by Cyprian Southhack, the mapmaker who had failed to recover the treasure in 1717, had, without meaning to, drawn Barry Clifford a treasure map. Clifford took Southhack's descriptions and his map, and he combined them with modern knowledge of how that coast had changed, how the sand and the shoreline had migrated over the centuries, and he worked out where the wreck should be now, as opposed to where it had been then. It was patient, unglamorous work, old letters and new charts, and a lot of careful thinking. And then, in the early 1980s, he took boats and divers and sensitive instruments out onto the water off Wellfleet, over the patch of sea his research had pointed him to, and he started to look for real. So how do you even find a wreck like that? How do you find a ship the sea has smashed to splinters, driven down into the bottom, and buried under 3 centuries of shifting sand, somewhere off a coastline that has itself moved? You do not go looking for a ship, because finding a wreck buried under sand is not like the movies. There is no ship sitting on the bottom with its masts still up. The Ouidah had been smashed to pieces and driven down into the seafloor and covered over. What Clifford was looking for was scattered, buried, spread across the bottom, hidden under many feet of sand. His team used instruments that could sense metal and disturbances beneath the seafloor, towing them back and forth across the water in long, patient lines, reading the signals, marking the places where something dense and man-made seemed to lie under the sand. And in the year 1984, they began to bring things up. Coins first. Old silver coins, the kind called pieces of 8, Spanish money that had circulated all over the Atlantic world in Bellamy's time. Then a cannon. Then more coins and more objects, all from roughly the right period, all lying in roughly the place the research had predicted. It was thrilling. It was also, and this is important, not yet proof, because the coast off Cape Cod has swallowed a great many ships over the centuries. Coins and a cannon and old wreckage told Clifford he had found a wreck of the right age in the right place. They did not tell him, beyond all argument, that it was the Ouidah. And Clifford knew that. He knew that a claim like his, the discovery of the first real pirate ship, full of the only verified pirate treasure, would be doubted and should be doubted, until it was proven past any reasonable question. So the search went on, into the next year, for the one thing that could settle it. And in the fall of 1985, they found it. It came up out of the sand as an ugly, crusted lump. That is how almost everything comes up from a wreck like this, and we will talk about why in a moment. But for now, just picture a shapeless mass of hardened material, the size of a big stone, brought up onto the deck of the boat. Inside it, when it was carefully worked over, was a bell, a bronze ship's bell, and on the bell, cast into the metal 300 years before, worn but unmistakable, were words and a number. The Whydah Gally, 1716. Take a slow breath there, because that is the hinge of the whole story. That bell is the same bell that hung on the ship on the gray London River when she was new. The same bell that rang the hours as she carried 500 captives across the Middle Passage. The same bell that rang as Bellamy chased her down near the Bahamas, and as she turned north with her fortune, and as the storm came up off Cape Cod on that last night. It went down with her, It lay in the sand for 268 years, and then it came back up into a living hand, with the ship's own name on it, and it turned a legend into a fact. That is what makes the Ouidah unique, and it is worth being precise about why, because people say it loosely. There have always been pirate stories, and pirate wrecks, and objects claimed to be pirate treasure. What there had never been, before that bell, was a shipwreck that could be proven, beyond argument, to have been an actual pirate ship, named, dated, and matched to a real captain and a real crew and a real cargo. The bell did that. It made the Ouidah the first fully authenticated pirate shipwreck ever found, and because her hold had been full of the accumulated plunder of dozens of ships, the treasure that came up with her became the only pirate treasure that has ever been recovered and verified as exactly that. Not Spanish galleon silver, not a legend. Pirate treasure, provably, with the ship's name on the bell to swear to it. So Barry Clifford, the Cape Cod boy who would not let the story go, had done the thing everyone said could not be done. He had found the Ouidah. But finding her, it turned out, was only the beginning of the real work, because the sea does not give a wreck back all at once, or easily, or clean. It gives it back slowly and locked inside stone. So let's go down to the sea floor one more time, gently, and look at how you actually bring a 300-year-old treasure ship back up into the light. Here's the thing about a shipwreck in the sea. It does not simply sit there waiting, like something dropped on a shelf. The sea goes to work on it. Salt water is hard on almost everything human beings make, and it is especially hard on iron. And the Ouidah was full of iron. Cannon, cannonballs, tools, fittings, nails. All of it began to corrode the moment it went under, and as iron corrodes in seawater, it does a strange and useful thing. It sets off a slow chemical reaction that pulls minerals and sand and shell and small objects out of the water around it and cements them together into a hard, stony mass. A lump. Archaeologists call these lumps concretions. So the treasure of the Ouidah did not lie on the sea floor as a glittering pile of coins. It lay there as rock. Coins fused together in stacks, a pistol locked inside a boulder of hardened sand, a cluster of gold, sand, iron, and shell, all cemented into one gray, shapeless, unpromising lump that you could walk past on a beach and never look at twice. When Clifford's divers brought up that first ugly mass with the bell inside it, that is exactly what they were dealing with. The treasure was there. It was just wearing 300 years of stone. And that changes the whole nature of the work, because you cannot just crack these concretions open with a hammer. Inside a single lump there might be coins, and a delicate piece of jewelry, and a fragile scrap of cloth, and a bone, all pressed together, all invisible from the outside. Break it carelessly, and you destroy the very things you are trying to save. So the recovery of the Ouidah became, and still is, one of the slowest and most patient jobs in all of underwater archaeology. It is not treasure hunting in the swashbuckling sense at all. It is closer to surgery. The concretions are brought up from the seafloor and taken to a conservation lab, and there the real, quiet, decades-long work happens. Each lump is first looked at without being opened, often with X-rays, the same kind of imaging a hospital uses, so that the conservators can see the shapes hidden inside the stone before they touch it. The X-ray shows the ghost of a coin, the outline of a buckle, the curve of a gun. Only then, knowing what is inside, do they begin to work the mass apart, by hand, with small tools, under magnification, a little at a time. A single concretion can take an enormous amount of careful labor to fully open and clean. The metal objects that come out then need saving in their own right, because centuries in salt water leave salt driven deep into the material. And if you simply let a wet, salt-soaked artifact dry out in the air, it will crack and crumble and destroy itself. So the conservators use slow chemical and electrical methods to draw the salts back out and stabilize the metal. One common technique passes a gentle electric current through the object in a chemical bath, coaxing the corrosion off and the salt out over weeks and months, until what was a shapeless green or black lump slowly becomes, again, a recognizable coin, a buckle, a shoe fitting, a fragment of a life. It is astonishing to watch, in the slow way that a plant growing is astonishing. Something comes back that had been gone for 300 years. And what has come back, over the decades since Barry Clifford found the wreck, is a whole world. More than 200,000 individual objects have been recovered from the Ouidah site. 200,000. Not $200,000. 200,000 things. Coins beyond counting, most of them those Spanish silver pieces of 8, the everyday money of the Atlantic in that century. Gold, worked and raw, jewelry. And among the most moving finds, hundreds of pieces of delicate gold work from West Africa, from the Akan peoples of what is now Ghana and the Ivory Coast, some of it cut into small bits, because to a pirate splitting a fortune by the rules, a beautiful gold ornament was just so much weight to be divided fairly among the crew. There were the guns, of course, cannon, brought up crusted and heavy, the very guns Bellamy had run out along the Ouidah's sides to make her a warship. Pistols, cutlasses, the hard iron tools of the trade. And there were quieter things too, the small human objects that tell you more than the gold does. Buttons and buckles, shoe fittings, bits of clothing, a teapot, the ordinary belongings of ordinary men who happen to be living an extraordinary and short and dangerous life. And do you remember the manillas? The little cast rings of brass and copper that had gone out from England in the ship's hold, on the way south, to be traded for human beings on the African coast? Some of those came up too. Hundreds of them, corroded green, brought back from the sea floor 3 centuries after they were made. Money, meant to buy people, riding in the same wreck as the treasure that buying and selling had ultimately produced. The whole grim triangle of the ship's life, from cargo to captives to coin, all of it there in the sand together, waiting to be read. It is worth pausing on how the delicate things survived at all, because it tells you something gentle about how the sea keeps what it keeps. Metal you might expect to last, but a silk stocking, a leather shoe, cloth and leather and bone should have rotted to nothing in 300 years of salt water. The reason they did not is the concretion itself. When those hard, stony masses formed around the wreck, they sealed whatever was inside away from the oxygen and the currents and the small, hungry creatures that break soft things down. The lump that looked like a worthless rock was, on the inside, a sealed vault. It held its breath for 3 centuries. And that is why, when the conservators finally opened them, they found not only coins and iron, but the soft, human, perishable things that almost never last. A stocking, a shoe, a scrap of a sleeve, the parts of a life that time is supposed to erase. So the finds are not only treasure in the pirate sense, they are the ordinary furniture of men living at sea. Pistols, some of them still found loaded and wrapped the way a man wraps a tool he expects to need. Cutlasses and muskets, the small iron hand grenades that boarding parties threw, cannonballs by the 100, and then, past all the weapons, the quieter layer, shoe buckles, cufflinks, a ring, fragments of fine cloth somebody had once been proud to wear, bits of pewter and glass, the everyday objects that turn a crew from a legend back into a group of specific people, each with his own belongings, his own small vanities, his own reasons for being on that ship. You can stand in front of a cutlass and imagine a pirate. It is much harder and much more true to stand in front of a cufflink. But the most important things the sea has handed back are not objects at all. They are the men themselves, because bones come up too. From early in the excavation among the concretions, there were human remains, not many at first and not whole. A bone here, fused into a lump with a coin or a buckle, a fragment there, the drowned crew of the Ouidah, or what the sea and the sand had left of them, coming up out of the bottom the same slow way as everything else, locked in the same stone. It is a solemn thing to sit with. The conservators opening a concretion never quite knew, until the X-ray, whether they were about to uncover treasure, or a pistol, or a piece of one of the men who died that night. Often it was some of each, pressed together, because in the chaos of the wreck, the gold and the guns and the people all went down into the same churning sand at the same moment, and the sea made no distinction between them. It still does not. To the sea, it was all just weight, going down, and the men keep coming up. As recently as the early 2020s, more than 300 years after the storm, the team working the wreck brought up something that stopped everyone. Inside the concretions, they found human remains in a quantity they had not seen before. One skeleton close to complete, and portions of 5 others. 6 of the Ouidah's dead, more or less, brought back into the light, still held in the stone the sea had built around them. 6 men, out of the roughly 144 who drowned. A small fraction of the lost. But 6 more than anyone had ever expected to look upon again. And here the modern part of the story does something the old treasure hunters could never have dreamed of. Because now there is a chance, a real, if difficult chance, of giving some of these men their names back. The people working the wreck have begun trying to recover genetic material from the bones, hoping the science might one day match a nameless skeleton to a living descendant somewhere in the world. It is not easy. Old bones that have spent centuries in salt water do not give up their secrets willingly, and the effort may not succeed. But it has been tried before, and it has already produced one quiet, honest surprise. Some years back, researchers took a leg bone from the wreck and compared it against the genetics of a known descendant of Bellamy himself, hoping they might have found the captain at last. They had not. The bone belonged to some other man, of Eastern Mediterranean ancestry, one more member of that astonishingly mixed crew, a man from the far side of a sea whose name we will probably never know. Bellamy himself is still out there somewhere, unfound or unidentified, lying among his men. Think about what that effort really is, underneath the science. It is people, 300 years later, reaching back into a wreck to say to the drowned, "We know you were here, and we would like to know who you were." Barry Clifford has called the wreck sacred ground, and you can understand why. It is a grave as much as it is a treasure. A grave of poor men and freedmen and forced men and at least one boy, from England and from Africa and from the Americas, who died together in a single night and lay together in the dark for 3 centuries, and who are now being brought back up, one careful lump of stone at a time, and looked at, and where it is possible, remembered. That is a rarer kind of treasure than the gold, and it is the part of the work that will probably go on the longest. The wreck site itself is still worked, season after season, in the good weather, when the sea off Wellfleet is calm enough to let divers down. It is not a museum piece frozen in place. It is an active grave and an active dig, out under the water off a beach whose visitors have no idea it holds anything at all. Because the beach above it is just a beach now. In the years since the wreck, that stretch of the outer cape became protected land, part of a long, wild national seashore, and on a summer day, it is families and umbrellas and the ordinary sound of the surf. Nobody sunbathing there is thinking about a pirate flagship a few hundred feet out and a few feet down. And yet, after a hard winter storm, every so often, the sea still lifts a coin out of the bottom and lays it on that same sand, and someone walking the tide line in the cold looks down and finds, glinting in the wet, a piece of Bellamy's fortune. 300 years later, still arriving. The morning after the wreck has, in a sense, never entirely ended. And here is the part that keeps the story open, that keeps it from ever quite ending. The bulk of the Ouidah's treasure has still never been found. Remember the estimate, 4.5 to 5 tons of gold and silver in 180 sacks. Only a fraction of that has been recovered. The rest is still out there, scattered across the sea floor off Wellfleet, buried under shifting sand that hides it one year and gives up a little the next. After big storms, even now, coins and fragments still sometimes wash up on the beach, the same way they did on the terrible morning after the wreck. The sea is still handing the Ouidah back, a piece at a time, on its own slow schedule, and it is nowhere near finished. So the work goes on. It has gone on for 4 decades, and it is not done. And what has come up out of the sand has found a home. So let's follow it ashore, one last time, and see where the ship ended up, and meet one small member of the crew again, the way I promised we would. I told you, back near the beginning, to hold on to the boy, John King, the child who wanted so badly to go with the pirates that he threatened to harm himself, and even his own mother, if they left him behind. The youngest pirate anyone has ever found a record of, somewhere around 8 to 11 years old, sailing on a treasure ship up a cold coast toward a storm. I promised you would meet him one more time. This is where, among the 200,000 objects that have come up out of the sand off Wellfleet, there was, at some point, another one of those unremarkable-looking concretions. A hard, gray lump, like so many others, brought up from the sea floor and taken to the lab, and set among the long queue of things waiting to be opened. And when the conservators finally work their way into it, carefully, the way they open all of them, they found something inside that stopped them. They found a small leg bone, a fibula, one of the 2 bones of the lower leg. And it was small, too small to belong to a grown man. Fused there in the same concretion, pressed together with the bone by 3 centuries under the sea, were 2 more things: a silk stocking of a fine French weave, and a leather shoe. A small leather shoe, only about 2 inches across at its widest point, made with real care, the kind of shoe a family with a little money might put on a child. A child's leg, a child's stocking, a child's shoe, all locked together in the same stone. The people who study the Ouidah did the careful thing. They did not simply assume. They had the bone examined by more than one expert, quietly, to see what it could tell them. And the experts agreed. The fibula had belonged to a child, somewhere between about 8 and 11 years old. And on a ship where there was only one child known to be aboard, the conclusion sat there, plain and quiet and almost unbearable. This was, in all likelihood, what remained of John King, the boy who had wanted so badly to be a pirate. He had gotten his wish, and it had lasted a few months and ended in the surf off Cape Cod on a night in April, and 300 years later, a small piece of him had come back up out of the sand, still inside his own small shoe. The man who did much of the work of understanding the Ouidah's people, a historian named Ken Kincor, who spent years with the wreck and the records, said of John King that he was the youngest he had ever come across in all the history of the pirates. And there is something about that shoe, more than all the gold, that tells you what this story actually is. Because the gold is abstract. 4.5 tons of it, sacks of silver, it is almost too much to feel. But a 2-inch shoe you can feel immediately. It makes the whole thing suddenly, painfully real. These were people, even the pirates, even the legend. There was a real boy, with real feet, in real shoes his family had bought him, and he drowned in the dark with everyone else, and the sea kept his shoe safe for 300 years, and then handed it back. So when you hear that the Ouidah is the only verified pirate treasure ever found, remember that the treasure is not only the coins, it is the shoe. It is the buttons and the buckles and the teapot and the small leg bone. It is the proof, object by object, that the pirate stories we tell each other were once, underneath all the legend, just people. Poor men mostly, and freedmen, and forced men, and at least one child, living a short, hard life on the water, and dying in a single night, and lying quiet under the sand for the better part of 3 centuries. And it is worth remembering how close all of this came to never being known at all. Because when Barry Clifford set out to find the Ouidah, almost nobody thought he would, and a great many people thought he was a fool for trying. There were 3 separate reasons to give up before he started. Some were sure the whole thing was only a legend, a Cape Cod bedtime story with no real ship underneath it. Some believed that even if the wreck was real, the treasure had been stripped off it long ago, by Southhack, or by the locals, or by the sea. And some, the practical ones, simply thought the remains would be too deep and too scattered under the shifting sand to ever find, let alone recover. Any one of those beliefs was a good enough reason to stay home. Clifford had to push past all 3, and it cost him. He began the hunt in earnest around the start of the 1980s, and for 4 long years he poured himself into it, into the old records and the charts and the endless days on the water. His business suffered. His marriage suffered. He was, by his own account, single-minded to the point of obsession, chasing a ship that most sensible people had decided did not exist. There is a version of this story where the bell never comes up, and Clifford is just another man who spent years and everything he had chasing a legend into the sand and came back with nothing. For a long time, that looked like the more likely ending. The coins in 1984 kept the hope alive, but it was the bell, in the autumn of the next year, with the name on it, that turned him from a dreamer into the man who found the Ouidah. And even then, it was not quite over, because a fortune that size does not simply belong to whoever pulls it out of the water. The state of Massachusetts came forward and claimed a share, pointing to a law it had passed about underwater fines and asking for a quarter of everything recovered. There were years of legal argument about who really owned the treasure of a 300-year-old pirate ship. In the end, in the late 1980s, the courts came down on Clifford's side, and he kept ownership of what he had brought up. The boy who had believed the story now legally held the proof of it. And here is the choice that matters most, the one that is easy to miss. Clifford could have sold it. A fortune in verified pirate gold and silver, the only such thing on earth, would have brought staggering sums if it had been broken up and sold coin by coin, ornament by ornament, to private collectors around the world. It would also have vanished. Scattered into 1,000 safes and display cases, it would have stopped being the Ouidah and gone back to being just gold. He did not do that. He kept the collection together. He set up a working sea lab and, in time, a museum, and he kept the finds as one whole body of evidence, documented and studied and shown to the public, rather than sold off and lost. That decision is a large part of why we can talk about the Ouidah at all tonight, as a ship and a crew and a story, and not just as a pile of coins that once passed through an auction. A scattered treasure tells you nothing. A whole one is a portrait. Everything that has come up from the wreck now has a home, on Cape Cod, not far at all from where the ship went down. The finds are held and studied and shown at the Ouidah Pirate Museum in West Yarmouth on the Cape. And for years the objects also traveled in a large exhibition that went from city to city so that people all over could stand in front of the actual coins, the actual cannon, the actual gold, and the bell itself, and read that name cast in the bronze. The Whydah Gally, 1716. What makes the museum unusual is that the work is not finished, and it does not pretend to be. It is not only a place where old things sit in cases with the story already tied up. There is a working conservation lab where the slow job of opening concretions and drawing the salt out of metal still goes on, year after year, because there are still concretions waiting, still objects locked in stone, still pieces of the Ouidah that no living person has ever seen. Visitors can look in on that work, on the actual, patient, unfinished business of bringing a 300-year-old ship back into the light one lump at a time. The story is still being told because the story is still coming up out of the sand, and out beyond the beach, under the cold gray water, the greater part of the fortune is still down there. Most of Bellamy's treasure has never been recovered. The 4.5 to 5 tons of gold and silver, the 180 sacks, only a fraction of it has come back. The rest lies scattered and buried where the storm put it, moving a little with the sand each winter, waiting on the sea. Which means that in a strange way the story does not have an ending yet. It has a shape, and a captain, and a boy, and a bell, and a great deal of proof. But the last coin is not in. It may never be. The Ouidah is still, quietly, out there. So let's leave the lab now, and the museum, and the coins in their cases. And before we make the last, slow walk back to you, and the dark, and the bed, let's sit for a while with a few of the quieter things this ship still has to say. There is no hurry at all. We have all the time we need. Think about how brief it all was. That is one of the things the Ouidah teaches, once you step back from her. We use a grand phrase for this period, the golden age of piracy. It sounds like it must have lasted a long time, a whole era of black flags and buried chests, generation after generation. It did not. The real high tide of Atlantic piracy, the years of Bellamy and Blackbeard, and the others whose names have lasted, was startlingly short. A couple of decades at most, and for any one man, far less. Bellamy himself was at the top of that world for less than a single year. Less than one turn of the seasons from the day he became a captain to the night he drowned. A year of fame that has lasted 300, and it ended almost as fast as it flared up. The same qualities that made these men briefly successful, the fast ships, the disregard for law, the willingness to take anything on the water, made them intolerable to the empires whose trade they were bleeding. So the empires answered. Navies were sent. Pardons were offered to the pirates who would quit, and gallows were built for the ones who would not. Within a few short years of the Ouidah going down, the golden age was effectively over. The famous names were dead or hanged or vanished into ordinary lives under new names in far ports. The whole thing burned bright and burned out in about the span of a childhood, which puts the men themselves in a truer light than the stories usually do. We picture pirates as a settled fact of the old world, a permanent hazard, salted old villains who did this for lifetimes. Most of them were young. Many were desperate. A great number had come to it the way Bellamy came to it. Poor men from hard places who had run out of honest options, or sailors who had been treated so badly on legitimate ships that a pirate crew, with its votes and its shared plunder and its rough fairness, looked like the better deal. Some, like Thomas Davis the carpenter, had not chosen it at all and were only waiting for a chance to get out. And some, like John King, were children. It was not a career. For most of them, it was a brief, dangerous, doomed gamble that ended quickly, one way or another. The Ouidah is the proof of that laid out in the sand. A single year of one young man's luck, and then a single storm, and then 3 centuries of silence. So how did something so famous last such a short time? And how did it end so completely, so fast, that within a few years the whole thing was simply over? The answer is that it never really had a chance to become permanent. It was a brief crack in the order of the world, opened by war and hard times and a few thousand desperate men, and the moment the great empires decided to close it, they closed it. The pirates had fast ships and courage. The empires had navies and gallows and time. There was only ever going to be one winner in that, and it was never going to be Black Sam. There is a temptation, with a story like this, to make it either all romance or all horror, and the honest answer is that it refuses to be either. The romance is real. A poor boy who talked like Robin Hood, a crew who governed themselves by vote in an age of kings, a fortune won on the open sea. And the horror is real too, and it is right underneath the romance, never more than an arm's length away. The fortune was built, at its foundation, on a ship that carried 500 human beings across an ocean in chains. There is no version of this story where you get to keep only the gold and leave the rest. The gold and the chains came up out of the same sand, in the same wreck, cemented sometimes into the very same stone. That is the truth of it, and it is a heavier and more interesting truth than the legend on its own. So when people say, the Ouidah is the only pirate treasure ever found, sit for a moment with everything that word treasure is quietly carrying. The silver, yes, but also the manillas that were money for buying people, the Akon gold, cut into shares, the carpenter who wanted only to go home, the pilot who survived the sea and was enslaved by the shore, and the boy, and his shoe. All of it is the treasure now, because all of it is what the ship actually was. The coins are only the part that shines, and then there is the sea, which does not care about any of it, and which is the last character in the story. Because none of this is really about pirates. It is about time, and water, and how the world holds on to things, and then, on no schedule of ours, hands them back. Cape Cod is a good place to feel that. It is a curl of sand thrown out into a cold, busy, dangerous ocean, and for as long as ships have sailed that coast, the sea has been taking them. The Ouidah was one wreck among a great many along that shore. Sailors used to speak of that whole outer beach as a kind of graveyard, a place where the coast and the storms and the shifting bars conspired to pull ships in and break them up. Countless vessels went down there over the centuries. Most of them left nothing but a line in a logbook and a few names nobody remembers. The Ouidah is unusual, not because she sank, but because she came back, because one man cared enough and dug long enough, and because she happened to be carrying the one thing that could prove exactly what she was, And even having come back, she came back on the sea's terms, not ours, not in a single triumphant haul the way a story would want, in lumps of stone over 40 years and counting. A coin this season, a cannon the next, a small shoe when nobody expected it. The greater part still down there in the dark, still buried, still moving a little with every winter storm. You do not get to hurry the sea. It gives back what it gives back when it decides to, and it keeps the rest. There is something almost restful in that if you let it be. The idea that some things are simply out of our hands, that they will surface or they will not, and either way the world turns and the tide comes in and goes out and comes in again, with or without us watching, which is, in the end, the thought to carry down into sleep, not the storm, not the drowning. Those are over, and have been over for 300 years, and cannot touch anyone now. The thing to carry is the patience of it. The bell, waiting quietly under the sand for 268 years, in no hurry at all, until the moment it was ready to come up. Nothing about it was anxious. It simply lay there, in the dark and the cold and the quiet, while the whole world it had known passed away, and a new one grew up above the water, and it kept the ship's name safe the entire time, asking nothing of anyone. That is a good thing to hold as you let the day go. And there is one more small thing worth turning over before we make our way home, about how much of what you think you know about pirates is real, and how much of it the Ouidah quietly corrects. Almost everything the movies taught you about pirates is either exaggerated or simply invented, and the Ouidah, being the one real pirate wreck we can actually study, is a quiet correction to most of it. Take buried treasure. The single most famous idea about pirates is that they buried their gold and drew maps with a cross to mark the spot. In truth, that almost never happened. Pirates spent what they took quickly on shore in the ports that would have them. They did not save. They did not bury chests in the sand for later, because most of them did not expect a later. The Ouidah's treasure was not buried by anyone. It was lost, by accident, in a storm, and the sea did the burying. The one real hoard of pirate gold we have ever found got into the ground precisely because a pirate failed, not because he planned. So where did the idea of buried treasure even come from? If the real pirates spent what they took almost as fast as they took it, why does every child somehow know to dig for a chest with an X on the map? The answer is that most of it came later, from stories, from novels and plays written long after the last real pirate was dead, by people who had never met one, and who found a buried chest far more thrilling than an empty purse. We inherited the pirates of fiction, not the pirates of fact, and the Ouidah, without meaning to, hands us back the difference. Take the flag. The black flag with the white skull, the one everyone can picture, did exist in some forms in this period, though it came in many designs and was not the single standard emblem the movies imply. Its purpose was practical and psychological. A pirate wanted his prey to surrender without a fight, because a fight risked damaging the ship and the cargo he was trying to take. The flag was a message. Give up, and you will not be harmed. Resist, and you might be. Bellamy's whole method, letting crews go unharmed, handing captains another ship to sail away in, was the same message in action. It was cheaper and safer to be feared than to actually fight. Terror was a tool for avoiding violence, more often than a taste for it. Take walking the plank. It is one of the most vivid images we have, and there is almost no good evidence it was a real practice in this golden age at all. It belongs to later stories, not to the actual records. The real pirates were violent when they were violent, but their cruelties, where they existed, were not theatrical set pieces from an adventure book. Mostly, men like Bellamy's crew were trying to make a living and stay alive, and elaborate ceremony was not part of it. And take the pirates themselves, one more time, because it is worth landing this gently. The picture we inherit is of hardened, lifelong criminals, old and scarred and wicked. The reality the Ouidah shows us is younger, sadder, and more ordinary than that. A crew drawn from the bottom of the world, poor Englishmen, freed Africans who had been cargo on ships exactly like this one, and now sailed as free men with a share and a vote. A mosquito pilot from Central America, a forced carpenter who wanted only to go home, a child. They were not a different species of person. They were people who had run out of other roads, briefly banded together under a set of fair rules in an unfair age, and mostly died young. The Ouidah does not give us a pirate story. It gives us the people the pirate story was always standing in front of. So hold that, softly, and then let it go, the way you are going to let all of it go in a few minutes. The real pirates were just people. The real treasure is proof of that, and the sea is still keeping most of it, and is in no hurry, and neither now are you. So let's make that last walk now, back from all of it, back toward the room, and toward you. Come up first, out of the cold water off Wellfleet, where the greater part of the treasure still lies scattered in the dark. Leave it there. It does not need you. It has waited 300 years, and it will keep. Come up through the gray water into the air, and stand for a moment on the beach at Cape Cod, where the whole story keeps returning. The long, pale sand, the dune grass bending, the Atlantic, gray and endless, going about its business the way it always has, taking ships and giving back coins on its own slow schedule. It is only water now. Nothing about it is a storm tonight. It is just the sound of the sea, rising and falling, the oldest and most patient sound there is. Now, come back through everything we followed, but lightly, the way you would trail a hand along a railing on the way to bed. The conservation lab, quiet after hours, the concretions waiting in their tanks, the small shoe safe in its case. The bell, with the ship's name on it, resting under museum light. Barry Clifford's boat, long since come in. The two survivors, Thomas Davis walking up the beach in the cold dawn, John Julian somewhere in the record we can no longer follow. The storm, blown out and gone for 3 centuries. Bellamy, young, on the deck of his beautiful fast ship before any of it went wrong. The Whydah turning north up the coast with her fortune and her boy. The chase near the Bahamas. The terrible triangle of her first voyage. And all the way back to the beginning, to the Grey River in London, and the new ship, and the bell being hung, and the name being cast into the bronze. Let all of it stand there behind you, complete, finished, needing nothing. And now come all the way back to here, to the room you are actually in, to the dark and the quiet, and the particular weight of your own body on the bed. Feel that for a moment. The mattress underneath you, holding you up, taking all of your weight so that your muscles do not have to. The blanket over you, the warmth you have made in this small space. You are not on a ship. You are not in cold water. You are here, warm and dry and still, exactly where you should be, at the end of the day, at the end of the story. And here is the strange, small connection, the thread that ties you to all of it. The silver in Bellamy's sacks, the coins still down there in the sand, the bronze of that bell, Every bit of it is made of the same kinds of atoms as you are. The metals were forged in old stars long before there was an ocean or a ship or a boy named John King. And so were the atoms in your own hands resting on the blanket. The same patient universe made the treasure and made you out of the same handful of elements, and it is in no more of a hurry about you than it is about the coins in the sand. There is nothing to finish tonight, nothing to solve, nothing to hold, so you do not have to remember any of this, not the dates, not the names, not the tonnage of the treasure or the year on the bell. It is not a test. If the whole story has already blurred into the sound of a voice and the sound of the sea, that is exactly right. That is the story doing its actual job. You were never meant to keep it. You were only meant to be carried by it, down and out and gently under, the way the sea carries everything in the end. And all of it will still be there in the morning. The wreck will still be off Wellfleet, in the dark, in the sand, holding the rest of the gold. The bell will still have the name on it. The little shoe will still be in its case, and the sea will still be handing the ship back, one coin at a time, on its own slow calendar, without needing anything at all from you. You can let go of every bit of it now. It is all being looked after. It has been looked after for 300 years. So just rest. Let the sea keep the treasure. Let the sand keep the ship. Let the room keep you. Breathe out, and let the whole day and the whole long story settle down into the dark and go quiet. And somewhere off a cold beach, under the water, in no hurry at all, the bell lies waiting, keeping the name safe, the way it always has.